Ja, guten Abend und herzlich willkommen beim JACOBIN Livestream. Mein Name ist Loren Balhorn. Ich bin Redakteur bei JACOBIN hier in Berlin und auch in den USA. Und unser Gast heute Abend ist Vivek Chibber. Das Thema ist Kapitalismus, oder was ist nämlich Kapitalismus und wie werden wir ihn los? Und ich höre irgendwie meine eigene Stimme im Hintergrund und das lenkt mich gerade ein bisschen ab. Entschuldigung. Ich fange nochmal von vorne an. Mein Name ist Loren, herzlich willkommen. Unser Gast heute Abend ist Vivek Chibber. Vivek ist Autor von des ABC des Kapitalismus, auch von dem Buch Postkoloniale Theorie und das Gespenst des Kapitals und ist vor allem auch der Chefredakteur von Catalyst, die Theoriezeitschrift von JACOBIN in den USA. Wir reden mit ihm heute Abend über das Thema Kapitalismus. Was ist es? Was macht ihn aus? Und vor allem, wie können wir ihn überwinden? Der Anlass für heute Abend ist, dass wir eine Neuveröffentlichung haben bei uns im Online-Shop. Die Broschüren von Vivek kamen bereits vor einem Jahr ungefähr aus auf Deutsch. Allerdings gibt es ab heute in unserem Online-Shop, den findet man unter shop.jacobin.de, auch die Broschüren als Audiobücher zu runterladen, vorgelesen von Lukas Turtur, Schauspieler an der Schaubühne Berlin, also ganz professionell, schön zu hören, leicht verständlich und alles für nur 10 € zu haben. Wir haben auch eine weitere gute Nachricht für alle JACOBIN-Abonnenten, nämlich, dass wir heute unsere nächste Ausgabe in Druck gegeben haben. Wir können euch heute Abend leider noch nichts vorzeigen, aber wer Interesse hat, kann morgen auf Page und Media-Kanälen schauen, wie die nächste Ausgabe aussehen wird und vielleicht auch ein paar Infos kriegen über das Thema. Ich switche jetzt auf Englisch. Vivek spricht kein Deutsch. Wir werden auch leider keine Übersetzung anbieten können. Allerdings, wer Fragen stellen möchte auf Deutsch, kann die gerne in den Chat reinschreiben und wir werden sie dann an Vivek stellen. Man darf aber natürlich auch auf Englisch Fragen stellen. Andere Sprachen bieten wir heute Abend leider nicht an. All right, Vivek, thanks a lot for taking time tonight or during your lunch break, as I assume it probably is.
Well, it's actually my nap time, so you should be very grateful.
Well, then I'm
really an old man.
Appreciate it. Yes, indeed. All right, we've talked about this topic a few times. You and I, we did an event in Berlin a couple years ago when we published the pamphlets. So it's not really the first time that I've heard you talk about this, but it's always informative. It's always illuminating, and I look forward to a few new nuggets of wisdom this evening. I want to start out with a pretty basic question. If we were talking maybe 20 years ago, this would probably be a pretty different conversation because capitalism would almost be seen as the default, the only way to run the economy. There was no alternative. We lived in a period where the idea that there was a system beyond capitalism or other than capitalism simply wasn't really in the discussion, and all that has changed. Although it's already 12 years ago now, or 13 years ago, all that changed in the financial and economic crisis of 2007, 2008, which itself feels like a lifetime ago. So these days, people are talking about capitalism. It's a topic in the media. It's a topic among politicians. But they're also talking about other things. I mean, we've seen an explosion of, maybe an explosion is too strong of a word, but we've seen a lot of discourse, a lot of discussions developing in the last 5 to 10 years around racism, around sexism. We've seen a number of different social movements around various oppressions and various important social issues that have emerged other than just a discourse around capitalism. Nevertheless, you decided to write 3 pamphlets that put forward the case that capitalism is really the central question. We have to be asking the central issue we have to understand. So why?
Well, thanks for having me, Loren. And for all of you out there in Deutschland, you'll have to put up with my English. So sorry about that, but I'll do the best I can. Look, for socialists, there has been a basic commitment from the inception of the movement to fight against all forms of social oppression, whether it's national, whether it's racial, whether it's gender, and of course, class. And yet socialists have always placed class at the center of their politics and anti-capitalism as their goal, even while they organize around all these other forms of oppression. And the question comes up, well, why capitalism? Why line up again? Why say capitalism is the problem? And the reason is that while there are many particular forms of oppressions and domination that people suffer from in capitalism. Racial minorities suffer from racism. Ethnic minorities will suffer from various kinds of ethnic oppression. Of course, women will suffer from gender oppression. Everybody in capitalism has to participate in the economy, whether they're female or male, whether they are black or white, whether they are Hindu or Muslim or Christian. Everybody participates in the economy. So the economy is one thing that affects everybody, regardless of race, regardless of gender. The second reason is the economy is set up in such a way in capitalism that it does two things. One is it systematically determines who has access to the necessities of life and who doesn't. And the reason it determines that is capitalism is a system. It's the only system in global history that we've ever seen in which everything is for sale. Everything that you need in your life, you have to buy on the market. In feudalism, you had access to land and you had access to the commons without having to have ownership of it. That means everybody had access to certain crops and certain basic necessities of life. Prior to feudalism, even in ancient Rome, ancient Greece, which were slave societies, even slaves had certain basic goods that they had access to. Prior to that, in hunter-gatherer societies, it was egalitarian societies. Everything was shared. What distinguishes capitalism is that it's the first society in which everything is marketized. Everything has to be bought on the market. And that's true whether you're black, white, woman, whatever. So it's the one thing that affects everybody. The second reason is that in capitalism, that access to the basic necessities of life or anything is unequally distributed. And this is the important point. It's unequally distributed because there are classes in which the owners of the means of production own all the wealth of society and control the production of goods and services. And the people who work for them, the wage laborers, the only way they get access to goods and services is by offering up their labor. Again, regardless of their gender, regardless of their race. Because they have to offer up their labor to people who own the assets. The people who own those assets not only have much greater access to goods and services, but they also control the ability of the vast majority of society to get access. If I don't have a job, I can't buy healthcare. If I don't have a job, I can't pay rent. I can't buy food, et cetera, et cetera. So if you're committed to a vision of society in which you think everybody has a right to the basic necessities of life, everybody has a right to develop their abilities, to have basic security so that they can build for a future. If you think that's the precondition for justice, then you cannot be in favor of a society where the vast majority of the people not only do not have access to the basic necessities of life, but are under the thumb of people who control everything. So that's one reason why you place capitalism at the center of it, because as long as the vast majority of the people are subject to the arbitrary power of a tiny section, you can't have a just and humane society.
All right, so I think a lot of people on the left, or even a lot of liberals, would sympathize with that explanation. I mean, even a lot of conservatives would understand, would agree that the economy is maybe the thing. I would argue the economy, along with the climate, are maybe the two sort of background or framework conditions that affect all human beings, and thus have a certain centrality in terms of quality of life and the kind of society we live in, or we want to live in. But if I wanted to ask you to narrow it down, what exactly defines capitalism? Because I think especially, perhaps in a German context, slightly less, but really anywhere, there's a very popular understanding that capitalism is basically private ownership, big corporations, the market, and socialism is the public sector, is the state. And you'll hear a lot of popular commentators so act like you can have some kind of mix between the two. You can have a little capitalism and you can have a little socialism. We'll maybe have, private control over some industries, but education, police, et cetera, that'll be public, and that's socialism. Is that at all a useful way to understand what the economy is or what capitalism is?
It is getting at a good way to understand it, but it's a little bit misleading. So let me approach it systematically. You asked by starting with the question, what's the essence of capitalism? The essence of capitalism partly is what I just said earlier. It's that you have for the first time a private ownership of the means of production. And with the private ownership of the means of production, you get a full marketization of society. Everything is commodified, everything has to be sold. The other component that's important to keep in mind, and this is going to help us answer the second part of your question. The other thing to keep in mind is it's not just that goods and services are privately owned and have to be bought. It's that the production and the availability of goods and services is governed by a particular logic in capitalism, and that is profit maximization. And this is the essence of the thing. In capitalism, it's not just that you have to go out and buy everything that you need. It's true. The people you're buying it from are people who are out to maximize their profits, not simply break even or just come out not losing money. And the reason that's important is the drive to maximize profits has an enormous bearing on people's everyday lives. In particular, since about 60 to 70% of the population works for a wage, it means that the people who they work for, in order to maximize their profits, will also try to minimize what they pay to their workers so that their profit margins are as high as possible. Now, why is this important? Well, workers buy everything they need with their wage. Now, if the person who they're getting their wage from is trying to squeeze those wages to as low a point as they can get away with, it means that for the people who are the vast majority of the population, who are trying to survive by buying things on the market, they're in a constant struggle against their employers to try to get the wage to a point where they can afford everything they need. For the employers, in the meantime, because they're trying to keep wages and other costs to a minimum, they have to exert power over their workers. They have to dominate them because workers don't like having to work for such low wages and for very long hours, et cetera, et cetera. Those employers, therefore, have to find ways of exerting their power over their workers. They do this in the workplace, of course, through management, through spying, through control, through the threat of firing them, et cetera. But they also have to now acquire power outside the workplace. They have to make sure that workers are utterly dependent on them, that they're afraid of being fired. Now, if workers outside the workplace have a big welfare state, if they have social democracy, that reduces the power of employers inside the workplace. So even in a society where you will have some kind of welfare state, where you will have some kind of public sector, there's two problems that can become a real liability. One is capitalists try to keep that social democracy, keep the public sector to a minimum. So even if you think of it, as you said, as an island of socialism, a public sector, government ownership is an island of socialism, it's not like you have it's sector care. They'd rely on tax revenues sector, unless you can figure out ways to insulate the public sector from having to rely on these revenues. That can be done, but it's not easy to do. Even if they're state enterprises that are making goods and services, if they're competing against the private sector, they will have to sell at prices that are competitive with the private sector, which means quite often that they have to kind of mimic what the private sector is doing. So in a capitalist economy, therefore, where the preponderance, where most of the labor and most of the revenues are coming from the private sector, it imposes great constraints on the functioning of the public sector. And you must never forget, capitalists never accept the public sector as a permanent fixture, partly because they see it as a weapon that the workers can use against them because they get access to goods and services for free and they're less dependent on the wage, but also because that public sector is artificially restricting the scope of the market. And capitalists would like to have access to those markets, which are right now dominated by the public sector firms and the public sector entities. So you can't think of it as a kind of a stable equilibrium with a certain component of the economy being private and another component of it being public. The public sector will always be in a state of defensive maneuvers against that private sector.
Mm-hmm. To what extent is the scenario you're laying out, or the picture of capitalism you're painting right now, to me still sounds very much like a picture of the way capitalism looks in Western Europe, in North America. Is this really a global scenario? If we were to look at lots of countries in the global South and sub-Saharan Africa, are they really capitalist in that sense? Do you have, for example, majority wage earner societies around the world?
It's an empirical question. We have to separate out two issues. One is the question of what is capitalism, which I've now, given you some sense of what it is. Then the question of how pervasive, how widespread is it in the world? And you're right that there's no reason to assume that the entire world is governed by this logic. 40 years ago, I think the answer to your question would have been, well, most of the Western world, as you say, is capitalist, but you've got the Soviet bloc, which is something, but not capitalist. It's some form, I think you could say, of class society, but it wasn't a capitalist class society. And much of the global South, I would have said, is only partially capitalist. This would be, say, 1980. But today, I think with a few exceptions, Loren, the world is now a capitalist world. The Eastern Bloc is not only capitalist, it's capitalism on steroids. It's been thoroughly transformed. Even in the global South, except for parts of sub-Saharan Africa, I think what you now have in the South also is a capitalist world. Now, it's different in important respects from the advanced capitalist countries, primarily in that, in, say, South Asia and in Southern Africa, you still have a rural economy. There's still a lot of agriculture. And there appear to be a great number of peasants that are producing on their own plots of land, and so are not, at least on the face of it, they don't seem to be wage laborers. Now, there's a cautionary note to that. The mere fact that in these parts of the world you have a lot of agriculture doesn't mean it's not capitalist. Those peasants, those independent farmers, by now are almost entirely dependent on selling on the market. And so they can't insulate themselves from the ups and downs of market fluctuations the way they could, say, 60 or 70 years ago. Most of them, furthermore, even though they have a plot of land, they get most of their income through wages. So they have a plot of land, but they also go out and work for, say, an agricultural capitalist, or they're migrant laborers who go out and work in the cities for part of the year and come back home for part of the year. That plot of land, therefore, isn't their actual source of income. It's a subsidy. It's a way they get economic insurance for themselves to ride out the insecurity of wage labor. The second way in which much of the global South is capitalist, but it's a different form of capitalism, has to do with the wage labor itself. Most of the labor in the global South is in what we call the informal sector, which means that they have very irregular employment in very small shops, no protection under the law, and they only work part of the year in the urban areas, and they might be going back home in the villages for the rest of the year. That is a certain kind of wage labor, but it is wage labor. It's a backward form of capitalism, but it is capitalism. So I think that in our basic description of the system, which is a system in which people are dependent on the market, production is carried out for profit maximization by privately owned firms, that now describes most of the global South now as well. If I had to put a number on it, I'd say 85% of the population globally now is market dependent, which means it's a capitalist world.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And where it's no longer possible to exist as an island outside of that world.
No, I mean, nobody could exist, no country could exist as an island before. They were always integrated to some extent, to a great extent, into the market. But today, it's not just that they're integrated and they're in touch with the market. The market is now determining people's lives.
Okay. Well, and how about in the capitalist core? How has class structure changed, or how has capitalism changed in that same time period? I mean, I think you dated it to 40 years ago. I mean, that's already older than me. I can't really remember a capitalism in which the majority of the wage earning population was, working in factories and kind of living that sort of stereotypical vision of what we think of industrial capitalism. But how, empirically, how has that shifted since the 1970s, not since the 1980s? In the West, or in the core capitalist countries, because they're not all in the West, is there a wage earning majority? Where do you classify all of the middle managers and people in between? And then,
So
the people who just run social media accounts.
If you're in capitalism, by definition, the majority of the population is going to be wage earning. If the majority of the population isn't wage earning, you're probably no longer in capital. You're in some other kind of system. Chances are. The numbers in the United States, in England, I'm not sure in Germany, are that about anywhere from 2/3 to 70% of the population is what you would call wage earners. And then the rest of the 1/3, most of it is what broadly speaking we would call the middle class. And we can talk about the various layers in the middle class. And then the top 1% or half of 1% are the people who run everything, right? The capitalists. So interestingly, if you looked at the population, say 80 and 90 years ago, the numbers would be broadly similar. You've always had a large middle class in Western capitalism, but it never amounted to more than a quarter or a third of the population. And you've always had a majority that was wage earners. So that's remained constant. What's changed is these sorts of venues in which they do their work. And as you said, Loren, 70 years ago, in Western Europe, the typical wage laborer was working in a factory somewhere. That's no longer true today. For about 60 years, I would say 40 to 50 years now, across the West, there has been a process of de-industrialization, where manufacturing and factories take up a lesser and lesser proportion of the labor force, and bigger and bigger chunks of the labor force are displaced primarily into the service sector, right? Into what we call services. That's true in England and the United States. It's less true in Germany. Germany has maintained more of a manufacturing base for itself, but that simply affected the pace of deindustrialization, not the fact of deindustrialization. So there's much more of the population today working in restaurants, in hotels, in various offshoots of the medical industry like nursing, in barbershops, places like that. Transportation, warehouses is another very big one. Now, this is all wage labor, so it's still capitalist, but the venue has changed. Now, why does that matter? It matters for a couple of reasons. First of all, it's made capitalism less fast growing. Manufacturing has the ability or the property of being open to much more systematic and rapid productivity increases than services do. Why does that matter? It makes capitalism slower growing. And a slower growing capitalism is one in which capitalists will be less tolerant of trade unions, social democratic institutions, redistribution, et cetera. So a slower growing capitalism is one in which capitalists intensify their attacks on the public sector that we were talking about earlier and on working class organizations. And this has been happening now for 35, 40 odd years. The second reason it's important is that as you have this structural transformation from industry and manufacturing into the services, it's doing a couple of things to the labor force. First of all, it's the home of the trade union movement. Its nucleus was always the manufacturing sector, factories. But as you have the structural transformation, inevitably what that means is factories are closing down and new operations are starting up in the service sector. But when factories close down, it means union jobs are lost. And the sector of the labor force that's in the union sector, that's unionized, is shrinking. All across the West, we've seen in the past 40 years, a shrinking of the unionized sector of the trade union movement, which also means a weakening of its political power. The second thing it does, the structural transformation, is that by putting labor and workers into these new jobs in the service sector, it also means that it's harder and harder to reorganize them into unions, because the service sector is harder to bring together into unions. There's smaller shops, the duration of employment is smaller, the number of workers in any given venue is smaller, which means you got to have many, many, many more organizers out there trying to bring them together. Collective bargaining is much tougher when you have hundreds of thousands of small units that all have to be now brought into some sort of agreement rather than a couple of hundred very large units that can all bargain together with their trade unions. So that transformation has given you a slower growing capitalism, a de-unionized capitalism, and a capitalism where it's harder to reunionize as compared to 100 years ago. That's the dilemma we find ourselves in. Now, the good news is it's still capitalism. You've still got people being exploited, leading terrible lives, being at the whim of their employers, hating their jobs. So all the motivation is there. The difficulty is it's harder to translate that motivation to be organized into actual organizing. This is the challenge we face all across the West today. And it's one to which we have no answer. And, ironically, going back to your earlier question, the West is finding itself in the situation that the global South has found itself in for decades, which is the labor force in the West is much more informal. They're relying on contracts, relying on temporary employment. This has been the face of capitalism in the global South for decades. And in a very important sense, you see North and South converging in the labor relations that they experience. That difference between the South and the North is disappearing in this respect.
What would you say to the argument? Because it seems like another side effect of all this is also the collapse of kind of a collective identity, right? That in sort of the golden era, quote unquote, of capitalism, but even before, in sort of Manchester capitalism, industrial capitalism, the experience of working in a factory with thousands of other people who dress like you, live in the same place as you, have the same living conditions as you, generated a much more kind of spontaneous identity as worker and made it easier for people to identify their class interests. That seems like that's something that we've also very much lost in the last 30 years, that simply people's identities of who they are fragmented. We have to somehow recompose that or recreate that idea.
Well, there's good news and bad news there, in my opinion. You're right that identities are much more fragmented today, and that has something to do with the way in which the structure of lived experience has changed. Everyday experience has changed for people. But I don't think that is something that we can attribute to the past 40 years. The era in which the working class had its own neighborhoods, had its own ways of life, its own pubs, its own cuisine, et cetera, its own media outlets. That era ended actually by the 1930s and 40s. In the first 2 decades after World War II, a lot of that was just ripped apart, at least in the United States, and I think also to some extent in England as well. I don't know so much about Germany. The economic geographies of cities changed dramatically in the post-war era. Now, in spite of that, though, class identities persisted all the way into the 70s and 80s. If you look at voting patterns, the voting patterns in social democratic countries all the way into the 80s are basically aligned by class. And people still identified themselves, therefore, through their class position. So the question then becomes, how did that happen when the actual economic segregation of the working class ended by the 1950s, and an integration was occurring between the working class and the middle class, the suburbanization that came with that, the integration through mass media that the Frankfurt School likes to talk, all that stuff was happening by the 40s and 50s. So how did they keep their class identity? Well, it has to do with the one thing you left out in your question, which is trade unions. A big reason why you had workers who are being integrated into bourgeois society, still maintaining their class identity, is that trade unions and political parties continue to mean something in their lives. They were the institutions through which they got their healthcare. They had their cultural institutions. The political parties delivered on promises that they made. The political parties actively fostered a class identity all the way into the late 60s and 70s, I think. And they were able to maintain that sense of belonging and community, even while the economic stuff underneath their feet was changing. What happened since 1980s in the United States and England, and from the 90s onward, I think in Germany, France, is that the parties now also started to reflect the atomization and the bourgeois culture that the rest of the political economy was displaying, and the trade unions began to dissolve. Now, once you have that happening, there's nothing to bring workers together as a counter movement to everything that's pulling them apart. And in the last 25 years, all the working class has experienced in the West is the relentless, remorseless logic of the market, the atomization that has come to them with the breaking up of their neighborhoods, and the insecurity that comes from the dissolving of the trade unions, and then the alienation from having political parties that tell them there's nothing we can do. This is a law of nature. You're just going to have to suck it up and take it. So you're absolutely right. The sense of identity, the sense of community, the sense of belonging has dissolved, but it's important to realize two of the crucial mechanisms that maintained that for the longest time were not structural. They were institutional. They were the unions and the parties, and they are part of the problem now.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's a great point to kind of call it halftime. For people who are tuning in late, we're talking to Vivek Chibber tonight. Vivek is the author of the ABCs of Capitalism, which have appeared in quite a few languages at this point. I actually happen to have the Bulgarian translation on me right now. But we're talking to Vivek because we're releasing German language audiobooks today. You can buy them at shop.jacobin.de for €10. All 3 pamphlets read by a professional voice actor and produced in a professional studio. You can listen to them on your ride to work or on your jog or while cooking dinner, whatever you want.
When you're out on a romantic date.
Exactly. I can't think of, frankly, nothing better to do on a romantic date than listen to a German actor reading Vivek's explanation of capitalism.
I couldn't agree more.
So we were kind of already transitioning in this last answer. We want to transition to the second part of the discussion, which is talking about, and we've established what capitalism is. We've established that it generates injustice, it generates inequality. We've also established that it creates some kind of fundamental cleavages, fundamental oppositions in society. And now we want to talk more about how do we get out of it, or how do we move past it. The foundation for this conversation would be an article that you wrote a few years ago called Our Road to Power, which we've also translated. That was in the first issue of the German language Jacobin, which you can also buy at our online shop. In fact, you might as well head over there right now and buy both the audiobooks and the first issue, or you can buy the whole package and get both the subscription as well as the first issue, so that you can read Vivek's words in German. But that article put out some pretty clear arguments about where you think we are and how the left, the socialist left, can begin to rebuild power. So I want to start where we just stopped on the state of the class today, because we have a couple chats, or a couple questions in the chat. Given the fragmented state of the class, there seemed to be a development of riots, movements like Black Lives Matter. Not that Black Lives Matter is a riot, but we have both the growth of sort of spontaneous outbursts of popular outrage, as well as more kind of fluid new social movements that seem to offer, at least in the immediate term, a more direct route to organizing. Yet you argue that organizing the working class is still absolutely essential to building any kind of political power.
Yeah, if there is a road to power, it goes through the working class. It's as simple as that. And an organized working class. Riots are no substitute for actual organizing. In and of themselves, whether it's a protest march, whether it's a riot, whether it's an uprising, rarely creates an imbalance in society. It temporarily calls attention to the injustices and to all the wrongs that are being carried out. But what the power centers in society can do is they can lock their doors, they can shut their windows, they can put police around their homes and their institutions and wait for the inevitable. The inevitable being people have to go home. You can have an Occupy Wall Street. You know what the mayor of New York said? Occupy Wall Street, but by the time November came around, he said, I'm just going to wait till January because winter is coming. As anyone who watches the Game of Thrones knows, winter is coming and these people are going to have to go home. what happens with protests and riots? There's a certain amount of explosion. Buildings are broken. Sometimes things are burnt down. There's an expression of anger, and then people go home. There is no substitute for actually wielding power. And these displays of outrage, while they're very important and they're understandable, they're no substitute for it. Everybody who's ever done any politics in the history of the world knows this. The only people who don't know it is the current generation of the left, and that's because they haven't seen organized power in 2 generations, and most of them are in universities and professions anyway, and they're political tourists. They're not people whose lives are built around organizing. They're people who are morally outraged and they love the spectacle, but spectacles aren't politics. If you want to actually achieve something for the long run, it's got to be through organizing. And the question becomes, who do you organize? Well, you can organize anybody, but if you're in capitalism, and if you agree that the power in capitalism resides with the capitalists, and if you agree that the capitalists depend on a flow of profits to maintain their stranglehold over society, then it's just logically following that the way to bring them to the table is to put a squeeze on their profits, to stop the flow of profits. Well, the only people who can do that are the people who work for them. And the left loves to talk about identities and all that. I've got news for you. Most of the Black and the brown population in the West is working class. So for all of your virtue signaling and all of your love of people of color, here's the good news. If you organize the working class, you'll be around non-white people, so you can feel good about yourself. You'll be doing racial justice as well. There's no way around the fact that unless you organize the people who make the profits, you will not have any power against the holders of profits. That's just what the left has known all along. The reason it has to be repeated ad nauseum today is that we've gone through 2 generations in which the people who call themselves the left have had no connection to the working class. They're almost all in the professions. And, obviously, for understandable reasons, they're trying to find ways of changing things without doing the hard, arduous work of actually doing the organizing. The bad news is you can't do it. Without the organizing, nothing is going to work. So the first step on the road to power is to have a left that is embedded and living the same lives as the majority of the population. We're not there yet. We're in the stage of having to convince the left that this is what you should be doing. But as you said, Loren, it's a lot easier today to even have this conversation than it was 10 years. 10 years ago, you couldn't even pose the question.
So it sounds like you're almost arguing for, there's an old American communist who lives in Berlin, Victor Grossman, who likes to tell a story of when he joined the Communist Party USA in the late 1940s. He was made what the party called a colonizer. He was sent to Buffalo and had to go work in a factory to organize the workers. Is that the kind of argument you're putting forward, that that's what the left, I mean, if the left is middle class, if it is a bunch of people in the professions, should we simply try to dissolve into they wouldn't even be factories. Should we dissolve into the Burger Kings?
Well, the class won't. You can't, left politics is not missionary work. You can't say to everybody who comes to the left, quit your job and go work in a factory, because they're not going to do it. That's exactly the same as a church saying to people, become missionaries. People don't do that. But if you have left organizations, if you have a DSA in the United States, if you have a Die Linke in Germany, the party has to figure out ways of pushing, subsidizing, financing the organization of the working class. Some proportion of that, small proportion, will consist of middle-class people essentially committing class suicide, leaving college, maybe quitting their jobs, and going and getting a job in a warehouse or a hotel or perhaps even a factory, some small proportion. But then that cannot be your organizing model. What those people will do, like the Victor Grossmans, they are catalysts, they are triggers. They go in and they help activate the working class so that people who are in the working class become their own organizers. But it is true, while that's your ultimate goal, the historic lesson is getting this organization dynamic moving and going has required parties stepping into the working class, oftentimes with middle class people who are coming in and quitting their jobs, and then getting that dynamic started. That does require to some extent, middle class people joining in and doing the organizing, but it can't be done as a lifestyle choice. There has to be an organization behind it that's funding it, that's coordinating it, that's drawing lessons, that's exerting discipline. Without a party, it's very hard to do it. Or some quasi parties, call it whatever you want. I am arguing for that, yeah, because that's the only thing we've ever seen that's worked. There is no other example of actual working class organization that I know of in the Western world in the modern era. And we have to try to learn from the history. If any of us can come up with a better model of how to get working class organization going, great. But I don't know of any other model that's sustained itself.
There's a question in the chat that I also wanted to ask, going back to what we were discussing a few minutes ago about the sort of the end.
Oh wait, Loren, you froze up.
Are employed.
Wait, you froze up.
Discussing about. Oh, can you hear me?
No.
No, I'm lost.
No, now I can hear you. Can you repeat the question?
Yeah. Okay. All right. Sorry, I thought I was still frozen. There's a question in the chat that I also wanted to ask. When we talk about the changes in the structure of capitalism in the West, especially, and the end of kind of large factories as the main site where most people are working in the West, it also means that a lot less profit is being generated there, right? And that we no longer have large manufacturing as a place where workers can stop production and really hit the boss where it hurts pretty quickly. So doesn't this run the risk, at least, of the overall structural power of workers in the West being reduced? Is it still?
Well, actually, it is true that. So let's make a distinction between the proportion of the labor force that works in manufacturing and the proportion of GDP that comes out of manufacturing. The proportion of GDP that comes out of manufacturing has actually not gone down nearly as much as the proportion of the labor force. And the reason for that is productivity has gone up so much. Remember I said earlier, manufacturing is much more amenable to rapid productivity growth than the services are, which means that even if you have fewer factories, they're actually producing a lot more value than the factories 30, 40 years ago. So what that means is, while fewer workers are employed in that sector, their structural power is still very great. It's still quite large. And if you can achieve power in those sectors, it gives you enormous leverage. Think of the global South. All across the semi-industrial countries in the global South in the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, the organized sector of the working class only accounted for about 5, 6, 7% of the laboring population. Yet they had enormous power. Why? Because they worked while they were only 7, 8% of the population, the venues that they worked in accounted for 1/3 of the total income in the economy. So the structural power was quite great, and that's still true today. But I want to say, I'm not advocating for only organizing in factories. While it's true that factories are still strategically important, you've got to organize workers wherever you can, whenever you can. And so in transportation, in warehouses, in those places, they're not factories, but they're very large. They have a history of organizing, and I think you can get it done. Where I'm pessimistic, I think in other sectors of the service economy, like restaurants, like beauty salons and stuff, that's going to be a lot harder. And you might have to bring in those workers through other mechanisms and not through collective bargaining. We'll have to figure that out. But the large employers today still very much exist. They may not be factories, but all large employers should be targets of organizing. And a lot of them are going to be warehousing and transportation, I think, what we call logistics. There's a big mythology around logistics today. Everybody wants to talk about it, but it's true. Logistics is a key sector. And I think it was always organized in the past, and it can still be organized today.
But we do have a larger group of workers than in the past employed in service industries with low profit margins. Do you think that's fair?
Hard to say, Loren, because it's not, we don't have very good data. Remember that, yes, it's true that manufacturing accounted for more of the working class in the 1940s and 50s, but much of manufacturing was very small shops, even in the 30s and 40s. Large factories loom large in our imagination, but large factories still accounted for a small proportion of the total working class. So without really good data on actual breakdown of operations in the 30s and 40s, what the proportion of employment venues was back then that was small versus large, without that, it's hard to make the comparison. And it's easy to fall into the assumption that everything we see today is different. And everything that was there in the past was, easy. That's why I said earlier that the middle class has always been quite large. There's always been also a professional class. The weights have changed a bit, but they're not so large as to think that the problems we're facing now are entirely new compared to the problems that were faced back in the 1930s and 40s.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, let's talk a little bit about socialism, because so far, I think everything we've talked about could also be a conversation held between union organizers who are just trying to get the unions back where they may have been 30, 40 years ago. And you have an argument in one of the pamphlets, I think it's the second one, you have kind of a schematization of 4 different scenarios. You have the United States in the 1930s, or no, you have the United States now, no labor movement and no labor party. You have the United States in the 1930s, labor movement but no party, and then you have Europe in the 30s where you have both a party and a movement, and Europe now, no, yes, Europe now, no movement and a party, something like that.
Yeah.
And you say something like the most likely situation in the United States, at least, is that we can get from the situation now back to the situation in the 1930s, right? That we can return to a point where we have fighting unions that can at least give capital a run for their money. Let's put it that way. So let's assume that we get to a point where that's possible, or where that's happened, right? And where we have a strong labor movement, and now we're talking about building a socialist movement or a socialist party. What's the exact distinction between the two?
Between what?
Between building a labor movement and building a socialist movement, right? Like, it seems like we have to do both at the same time.
Right. You do have to do both at the same time. So let's pin this down a bit. The question is, what's the difference between building a labor movement and a labor party, or a labor movement and a socialist movement?
So there's a difference.
Yeah, there can be two movements: labor movement and socialist movement, or they can be labor movement and labor party. So you've got labor movement in both of your questions. The question is, are you asking what the difference is between a labor movement and
what's the role of a socialist party within the broader labor movement? How do we build it?
Right. So I think a party, first of all, you can have a labor movement without a labor party. But a labor movement without a labor party is going to be constrained in very important ways. And the American experience is an example of that. The reason it's important to also have a labor party is that a labor movement gives you lots of power outside the state. But you also want some representation within the state. And the reason for that is, if you have representation within the state, then the party that is representing you can use every bit of leverage and every bit of muscle you have in civil society and maximize whatever it can get out of it through legislation. If you don't have your own party inside the state will have to be dragged kicking and screaming into giving you the legislation you want. So rather than having a party that can maximize every bit of leverage that you can give it, instead you'll have political representatives who are trying to blunt whatever you're doing in the labor movement outside the state. And that American experience is a great example of that, where the Democratic Party had to be dragged into social democratic reforms in the 1930s. And a big chunk of that party continued to fight against the welfare state in FDR's time, under Truman, and after. So the labor movement was essentially having to fight two parties, not just one party. And that's where Europe differs from the United States, because in the best of the social democracies that Europe had, parties tried to get whatever they could for their constituency with whatever little power the constituency had. So the party is absolutely important. The second reason the party is important is that I don't think a socialist movement can succeed if it's just basing itself on labor's demands. A socialist movement also has to represent other sectors of society, oppressed groups, minorities, people who suffer from gender oppression and sexual oppression. Labor movements won't represent them. Labor movements are much narrower, understandably, and have narrower concerns. The party turns the labor movement into a representative of the total social gamut of social interests, so that you can reach beyond the working class and also bring in sectors of the middle class to that working class project. And you have to, because the middle class is not a tiny proportion of the population anymore. We're talking about at least 1/4 of the population, probably more. You're not going to bring all of them over, but you need to bring a lot of them over. And parties are able to do that and extend beyond narrow class demands that they're making. They can become hegemonic, right? To use a kind of a jargon, a piece of jargon. And then even on the narrow class question, parties are important because parties help lift the trade union leadership out of its very narrow bread and butter concerns and coordinate its actions across as a class, rather than simply individual sectors within the class. You have to therefore have the party. The difficulty of the socialist left in the past 50 years or so is that there's never been any shortage of parties. You have all these tiny little sects, you have all these tiny little groupules who declare themselves to be parties, but they have no connection to the class. So where we are right now is we are in a situation where the class, as we talked about earlier, Loren, is atomized, is angry, is disillusioned, and it has neither the unions nor the parties. There's no shortage of tiny little social, I call them social clubs, that meet every 2 weeks and have a discussion around socialism and call themselves parties. But you're not a party if you're not organically linked to an economic class. And the left, because it has no links to it, is really more talking shops than anything else. The closest thing we have to now, right now in the West, to such a party is probably the DSA, but the DSA's own connections to the working class are very, very, very thin. And as you've written about, Die Linke in Germany had, I think, some aspirations to be such a party, but it's met with very mixed success at best. So we're right now we are where the European left was, say, in 1880, which is you have an unorganized working class and you have a emerging culture of middle-class socialists who are starting to see the importance of class organizing, but have not yet been able to make any real headway in that effort.
And where do you think, what kind of models can we look to? I mean, you kind of put forward an interesting synthesis, I think, in Our Road to Power, that you defend sort of the classical Leninist model of building a party, at least, but you distinguish between organizational and institutional power. So we need to build a disciplined party, but we can't follow a revolutionary or at least a classical revolutionary scenario. So where do you see, in an ideal situation, where do you see possibilities for socialist advance politically?
I don't think we have right now a model of a party for the 21st century. It hasn't yet emerged. So when we don't have such a model, what do? As always, you look to the past and you see, are there lessons, are there things we can draw on from the past that might help us in the future? My own view, and this is just my view, and we will find out through practice whether it works or not. My view is that there are elements of the Leninist experience that are indispensable, that have to be carried forward into the future, and then there are elements which we can't have. The elements that are indispensable, I think the reason to think they're indispensable is that it wasn't just the Leninist parties who used them, but every party that is geared towards mobilizing a base has used this model. That not just Marxist-Leninists, but social democrats. And also, I think the most powerful party in the world today is a quasi-fascist party in India, the BJP. And the BJP is organized like a Leninist party. It's a cadre-based party. So that's good reason to think that there's something in this model that works. Now, what is that model? I think the indispensable components are, it has to be ideologically coherent. Now, that means not just anybody can enter. You have to have criteria for people to enter the party, which means, again, the DSA is just ruled out, because the DSA, the way you enter is you click on a link that says, hey, want to be a socialist? And it's up to you to define what a socialist is. There's got to be tests as to who comes in. Secondly, it has to have cadre. That is, it has to have people who are full-time organizers, kind of missionaries for the party, who go out and do the work of bringing its constituency together and holding it together and being the arm of the party that is there to mobilize that constituency when political mobilization is needed. Okay, that means the Democratic Party, the Republican, these are not parties. They're something else. And most parties in the West today, by that definition, are not cadre parties. They've ceased being cadre parties. But because of that, they're also ceased having a connection with their base, and they ceased being parties that can mobilize. That's part of the reason the left is in the working class is in such crisis today, because it sees no parties connected to them in any way. The social democratic parties of the West had a cadre base from the 20s all the way into the 60s and 70s. That was gone by the 70s, right? I think that has to be there, because any party that succeeded in the past from the left had that. So you have to have cadre. And the final thing is, it's got to be embedded in the working class. It can't be lobbyists. It can't be professionals. It can't be consultants. It can't be base itself on focus groups and public opinion polls. It has to be living the lives of the working class, and so that it can organically see what the conditions are that they're facing, build a program around that, and then mobilize them around it. Every single party of the left that's ever succeeded has had that. Indeed, any mobilizational party, the Nazis had it, the BJP has it. Any party that's trying to mobilize has had that. So I think that is indispensable. Now, what is it that you have to do away with? Well, I mean, obviously, the internal culture that we now associate with Leninism, that was very top-down, that was very undemocratic, that has to go. The good news is, these parties, when they worked, when they were actually successful, that was before they became the orthodox Leninist parties. When they were successful, they had a functioning democratic culture, internal debates, which means it's not only possible, that was one of the reasons those parties succeeded, which means we can do it again. So, and the final point, you kind of alluded to this, that's a longer discussion, maybe we should have that, is, these parties have to recognize that the road to power cannot go around the electoral arena. It has to go through the electoral arena. For the longest time, Leninist parties were understandably skeptical of taking part in elections. They rejected elections. That's gone now. If you don't take part in elections, you're going to be marginal and you're going to be isolated. So electoral participation has to be part of the model. It just cannot descend into what I call electoralism, where all you're doing is fighting in elections. Because if you fight in elections without a actual class base, actual physical presence in the working class, you'll get sucked into the bourgeois state and you'll never come back out.
Well, there have been a couple questions about that in the chat, specifically sort of the contradictory nature of unions and parties, both contesting as well as integrating into the state. So I'd like to hear from you, what does that road look like? What do you think it could look like in the 21st century? When we're in hostile territory, we have, as you put pretty clearly in the article, we have a very cohesive and stable ruling class that's very aware of its interests, infinitely more almost omnipresent and omniscient than it was 100 years ago. What does socialist advance look like then?
I mean, there are many aspects to a socialist advance today that we simply do not know right now. We're going to have to discover them as we move along, because as we've said in this discussion, there are many aspects of contemporary capitalism that are quite different from the capitalism of 100 years ago. Okay, so we have to be very open and strategically, or at least tactically flexible. But I think there are a couple of things, Loren, that we have to face up to, which are quite clear. And that is when you say, what can we look to? What works? for much of the socialist left after 1968, the idea was you have to look to the lessons of the Russian Revolution, perhaps the failed German Revolution. If you were in a Maoist group, the Chinese Revolution, that's what you try to build on. And they sort of set aside the experience of the social democratic countries because they were reformist. They sold out. They didn't really fight for socialism. They accommodated to capitalism. So you have to go the revolutionary route. My view is, and this is somewhat controversial, but you have to at least consider it. The era of revolutions is over. I just don't see any rational basis for arguing that there is a revolutionary path. Path means you know where to go, what to do, how to do it. I don't know how you can credibly make an argument that there is a path to power through revolution in advanced capitalism when we have never seen anyone actually take that path. There has never been a revolution in an advanced capitalist country. There has never been a revolution even in a country with a democratic state. So what is the path? We don't have a model of it. I suppose it could happen. I suppose it could, but it's a leap of faith. It's almost magical thinking. For a rational political discussion, then, you can't say, well, let's hope something happens. That's essentially like saying, let's hope Jesus comes down to earth because we don't know that he can't. The path has to be something you've seen before. The closest approximation to the situation we are in now, where you have a bourgeois state that's stable, you have a working class that could be organized, where there's social democratic reforms that are very popular. The closest approximation is, in fact, those very social democratic countries that the left refused to take seriously for decades and decades and decades. Those countries, I think, show us the following. The path to power leads through a combined mobilization of an electoral constituency and real power within the workplace. The power within the workplace gives you leverage against capital, which is the center of power in our system. And the electoral constituency gives you a presence within the state to then pass legislation that further increases the power of your organized working class. Now you get an interactive process where you're using the threat of economic strikes and economic dislocation to open up capital to giving you concessions. The concessions are then effectuated within the state through your political party. And that political party rings concessions which further give you power in your class and which give greater popularity and legitimacy to your political party. That's the process we've seen work. Now, that could lead to a potentially revolutionary situation sometime in the future. But now at least we have a rational basis for thinking of how to get to a revolutionary situation instead of engaging in magical thinking that it'll just happen. And what happens then? I don't even know what the model is. So in my view, what we can rationally say is the road to power goes through using elections to build class power, then using the class power to make further inroads into the state. That's about all we can say right now.
Can you think of any mechanisms or strategies that we could entertain to avoid repeating the limitations of the 20th century experience? I mean, whether we're talking about classical social democracy or post-war social democracy, it seems history seems to suggest, and I think that's maybe one reason why, at least emotionally, young radicalizing people tend towards the revolutionary road, is we don't have any examples of a revolution in the West, but we also don't have any examples of a social democracy turning to socialism. And how? No,
but listen, let's be clear about something. For social democracy to be rebuilt, even if it doesn't turn to socialism, is a world historic victory right now. And the only people, in my estimation, who say, well, social democracy isn't good enough, we want socialism, are people who are not suffering from the depredations of capitalism. To my mind, in the United States today or in India today, if you can get a viable social democratic state of the kind you saw in the most advanced social democracies, you have to be a moral cretin to say that's not acceptable. So let's at least agree that you might, even if you don't see actual socialism, just to get to social democracy today would be great. And I have no hesitation in saying that. Okay, but you're absolutely right that we haven't seen an example of that transforming to socialism. But here's the bad news. You've never seen a revolution transforming to socialism either. You want to go live in the Soviet Union in 1953? Be my guest. You want to go live in China in 1966? Good luck. It's just nonsense to say that, to point out that you haven't had socialism through social democracy and ignore the fact that you haven't had it anywhere else either. In fact, of the two models, social democracy has survived longer. I'm no big fan of social democracy as the endpoint, but it's lasted longer than any of the Soviet experiments did. So there's not a leg to stand on if you're dismissing social democracy because it didn't give you socialism. Now,
sure,
yeah,
but if we're just playing, if we're kind of playing out the scenario intellectually, do you think there are some kinds of political levers or institutions that we could think about that would help to safeguard the gains, so to speak, or prevent falling backwards?
The most obvious one, which everybody points to, would be to somehow slow down or reverse the dismantling and the weakening of trade unions across the West that occurred from the 1970s onward. Everybody understands that the retreat of social democracy followed on the heels of the retreat of trade unions. Now, the problem is we haven't found an answer to the forces which brought about the retreat of the trade union movement. It's very easy to say that the trade unions fell apart because the leadership sold out, the kind of standard Trotskyist answer, that they were bureaucratic, they didn't mobilize. I mean, that's part of the reason, but there were very powerful structural forces at work as well. The most important of which was what you alluded to earlier, which is actual changes in the occupational structure, actual changes in the economic living conditions of workers, and the skill distribution within the workers. So sections of the working class peeled away on the one hand, like in Sweden, where the white collar unions, and in Germany, the white collar unions broke away from the blue collar unions. And then a big chunk of the labor force, unionized labor force, just lost their jobs from de-industrialization. Okay, do we have a solution to that? Anybody who says they do is lying. We don't have a solution to that. We know at least what we would like to get to, which is holding labor together. The difficulty of holding it together is that capitalism never stands still. It is a system that is constantly restructuring the labor force, dissolving old skills, moving from one geographic location to another. And it does it in order to reconstitute the power of capital. Capital is always mobile, it's always changing, labor is always playing catch up, and we haven't found a way to get around them. Okay, that means, well, does that mean that we have no answer? I have one particular concrete solution to some of these problems, and that is, I think the important precondition to the defeat of the left in social democracies was that capital always had the weapon of slowing down investment or moving out of the country and thereby imposing economic blackmail on labor. Well, I think one solution to that is for any left in the future, I think we should rapidly move to decrease the scope of the private sector in the economy so that the ability of private capital to hold a gun to the head of the rest of the population and say, if you don't give us what we want, we'll go on a capital strike. Or if you don't give us what we want, we'll move capital out of the country. That ability is reduced. Typically, the left says you reduce that ability through imposing capital controls. Let's restrict the mobility of capital. I don't know if capital controls can work or not today. If they can, we should do it. But an equally important, or perhaps in my opinion, more important component has to be take chunks of the private sector into state control. I think my model is if you just brought healthcare, utilities, transportation, education, and important elements of the media into public ownership, you've taken over about half the economy. And now you've reduced also the structural power of capital. And now you have the ability to build through the power of the labor movement and further restrict its scope. But if you can have as a standalone project 40 to 50% of the economy out of capitalists' hands, it gives you some breathing room. In the very first question, I'd said it still doesn't give you socialism, and I agree with that. It'll still be under constant attack, and that's absolutely true. But at least you'll have something, and then you can move forward. And the good news is there's enormous public support for renationalizing these sectors. And we know we can do it. It's been done in the past. We know we can make it work. We don't know if central planning will work. I don't think it can. But we do know a significant renationalization of the economy can work. I think that's the place to start. And then we can think about how holding labor together, holding the trade unions together in the private sector. In the public sector, they'll have much more breathing space. You can sustain them. So it gives you both political leverage and insulation from the economic power of capital.
There's a question in the chat that I'd like to throw in right now because it relates directly to what you just said. Somebody wrote that at least in the Western world, your argument and your strategy seems to make sense, but to what extent in Africa or China, et cetera, can this model be applied beyond Europe and North America?
Okay, you froze up for about 8 seconds, so let me repeat the question and see if I understood you. The question is, my arguments have some validity in the Western world, but would they also apply in poor countries?
Yeah.
Yes, they would.
But do you have the material even to work with? You know what I mean? I mean,
what material?
The economic material to, you know, something like taking over control of successive parts of the economy in an emerging economy. Will that work?
Why not? I mean, that's actually what they did for 40 years. Say, where in the globe was the largest expansion of the public sector in the capitalist world from, say, 1940 to 1980? It was in the global South. So of course you can do it again over there. So in terms of the logistics of it, of course you can do it. The difficulty in all of this is how will you actually get the power to do it? So in the global South, you were able to do it because you use the power of the independence movements, the anti-colonial movements, and then in the 1930s, the dislocation of the Great Depression to do it. Today, none of those things are on the table, and the capitalist class in the global South is very, very powerful. It won't sit around to be renationalized. So that's a separate question of having the political wherewithal to do it. But in terms of a working model, the model that I've advocated comes out of the global South. It's not just that it can be done there. They're the ones who pioneered it. So of course, the validity is very much there, North and South. The obstacle is mainly a political one, which is how are you going to get the leverage to actually do it?
Also on the question of politics, I wanted to ask you about the role of, I mean, sort of in the phase we're in right now, trying to build organized labor's power, but also build powerful socialist parties that can you know, provide sort of a more radical political impetus to the labor movement. What do you think is the role of ideas, and maybe also of media? You know, I mean, sort of the social clubs that you were describing that characterize much of the radical left, and that I at least spent quite a bit of my youth in. There's a major focus on ideas because that's really all we can do. All we can do is put out a line. Do you think they matter when you really reach some kind of an institutional power, organizational power? To what extent is the line and the ideology, so to speak, being put forward still play a real role?
Oh, it's crucial. It's always been crucial. So we often think that the reason the left obsesses with the line and ideas and all that is because it's got too many intellectuals in it. It's got nothing else to do. It just sits around, and that's what people do when they sit around. No doubt, that's to a large extent true, that when you don't have anything else to do, you'll just debate ideas all day long. But go back and look at the history of the left when it was actually enjoying some success, and you'll find all they did was debate ideas all the time. They debated the line, they debated what the slogan should be, they debated how to present them to people, et cetera, et cetera. They had Lenin in 1908, after the defeat of the revolution of 1905, sits down and writes Materialism and Imperial Criticism. He goes into Hegel, you know. So whatever else you can say about Lenin, he didn't like wasting time. Why is he doing all this? And the reason is, for the left, having the right strategic perspective is absolutely crucial. And the reason it's absolutely crucial is that if you have misaligned yourself to the circumstances, if you've misunderstood the situation, if you've packaged the wrong slogans, you'll get beaten. And once you're beaten, it's easy to dismantle everything you've built up. And you now are in the position of having to rebuild, of having to remobilize in a situation where the structures are all lined up against you. And that's why the left always intuitively understood, if we get this conjuncture wrong, if we misanalyze the situation, if we make the wrong agreements, we're going to be set back in a way that makes it very hard to rebuild for years and years and years. So all that is very important. Now, that should be distinguished from the question about the media in the following way. I think that the left needs to have its debates. It needs to have an internal, vibrant culture of discussion. It needs to talk about the right ideas, the right slogans, and it also needs to have its own organs, its own media, as it were. In the old days, it was newspapers. Today, it might be websites, might be, pamphlets, etc. But trying to affect the bourgeois media is a whole nother thing. And I'm much more pessimistic about that. I think the left has to have its own ecology of papers and websites, et cetera, and I don't know if this is at all what you had in mind when you brought up the media, Loren, but any dreams you have about taking on the bourgeois media, obviously, it's just not gonna, I don't think that's gonna happen. We have the Corbyn and the Sanders experience to show us. You should not look at the media as journalists. The media should be seen as a section of the capitalist class, and the journalists should be seen as professional ideologues. That's all they are today. There are very few actual journalists working in mainstream media today. They're really quite morally debased people.
I think that's I think the viewer who wrote the question about the media in the chat was looking for something quite along those lines. Oh. Wrapping up, I just want to ask one and a half last questions. So since you've written the article, we, or those of us who advocate for some kind of a parliamentary combined road to socialism, have had some pretty exhilarating times, but have suffered two pretty crushing defeats. I think it's fair to say, at least disappointing defeats. Let's put it that way. Has the defeat of Corbyn and also the defeat of Bernie Sanders changed anything in your thinking, or some people on the perhaps the more, I don't know what you want to call it, but there were definitely voices coming out in the summer saying that after Bernie, after Jeremy, it's clear that this was an illusion, that we could. That the ruling class would give the left this kind of space to allow them to take up this space in the parliamentary system. I assume you're going to disagree with that, but have these experiences at all changed your thinking?
Not one bit. They've actually solidified it. What was an illusion and continues to be an illusion is the notion that if you just run for elections, you can have a road to socialism, or even a road to social democracy. As I said earlier, electoral participation is not the same thing as electoralism. What we have right now in the United States is just electoralism. We have lots of left-wing people running for office, actually meeting with some success. Right now, there's actually a lot of exuberance around electoralism because socialists are winning office right now. The defeat hasn't yet set in. They haven't yet seen how limited it's going to be, but I don't have a doubt in my mind that this stuff's going to come crashing down pretty quickly unless it's used as a means to organize the class, because there's no class organizing going on right now. Corbyn absolutely showed the limits of a revival of social democracy without a working class revitalization. I mean, what happened in England is an absolute calamity, much more so than the United States. The Corbyn left inside the Labour Party is in disarray right now. It's in tatters. it met with such a crushing defeat. It's not the case in the US. In the US, the Sanders left continues to grow stronger. It's a very different scene over here. But there's no doubt whatsoever that that left will not get very far without real organizing. What it's managed to do so far is mainly make a dent in public opinion, and that's very important. But public opinion doesn't win you anything. Public opinion is something the ruling class knows how to either ignore or to change or to crush. So that's not going to be enough. In my mind, therefore, what it's shown us, both of these experiences, is that it's good to have an electoral presence if the alternative is zero. But the electoral presence without a class base is going to have very limited success. Now, to your point, Loren, about the demoralization that sets in, if anybody thought that you could come out of 50 years of wilderness, defeat, atomization, confusion, moral, intellectual degeneration, and the collapse of the left, you could come out of that and suddenly meet with success, they hadn't thought about it hard enough. We are literally now trying to rebuild a left from ground zero. We were at zero in 2005. Yeah. So it's going to take a while, and there'll be other defeats as well. But for those people who say that this was an illusion, I come back with the same question. What's your solution? Oh, you're going to have your revolution, are you? Cool. Let me know. I'll be there. But if you want to get serious about politics, you'd better understand you're going to meet with some defeats right now. If you want to talk about revolution, fine. Whatever cafe or classroom you're sitting in, go ahead. But until you can actually show me some examples, I will continue to court and to risk defeat through something that I think is reasonable and rational rather than engaging in magical thinking.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. We have one last question related to the state of the Bernie left. Obviously, because it's the United States, it dominates the world culturally. We all listen to American music, we all watch American movies, and also American politics tends to be particularly dramatic. Everyone in Europe on the left is pretty captivated by what's going on in the United States and continues to follow AOC and Bernie, et cetera, religiously. We have a viewer in the chat who asked, what can European leftists do to support the American left?
Silly question. Why should you've got a country of your own. Build a left in your country. What are you doing obsessing over American politics? You've got too much time on your hands. What you should be asking is, what can we do to build the best thing you can do to help the American left is to build a left in your own country. You'd be surprised to learn how much time Americans spend following your countries, whether it's Germany, whether it's England. The left is a global phenomenon. And in the state of demoralization right now, success anywhere will help build success elsewhere. So my recommendation, for whatever it's worth, is focus on your country. It'll help the US left much more than you're trying to build the US left from 8,000 miles away.
And you can do that by going to shop.jacobin.de and for 10 euros, getting the audiobook version of Vivek's ABCs of Capitalism to have a better understanding of the system we live in. And then you can shell out another 10 euros to get the first issue of Jacobin, in which we have Vivek's essay explaining how we get past capitalism. I want to thank Vivek for spending time with us and talking. Thanks to everyone who listened, who watched, and who gave us questions to talk about. I'd also like to thank Lucas Turtur for recording the new audiobooks, and also Jakob Turtur, who handled the production. They sound fantastic. I myself am a little bit surprised we managed to put something like that out. And don't forget, if you haven't already, subscribe to Jacobin at shop.jacobin.de. Our next issue went to print today and should be in mailboxes at the end of the month. My name was Loren. Thanks again to everyone.